She pulled me close in the freezing dark. We had no choice. The cold void of space felt even more unbearable as Cadden stared out at the stars through the cracked windows of the damaged ship. The ship's hull creaked under the strain, and the low hum of the failing engines barely registered above the growing silence. Everything was falling apart. The comms were down, the life support system flickered intermittently, and most of the ship's vital functions had gone offline after the ambush by the alien fleet. Cadden sat in the control room, his hands gripping the edge of the console, his knuckles white from the tension. The rest of the crew had been lost in the battle, leaving him alone with a dying ship. He could still feel the sharp sting of the explosion that had rocked the ship, throwing him against the console, leaving him with bruised ribs and a pounding headache. But it wasn't the pain that gnawed at him now, it was the cold. The temperature inside the ship was plummeting. The life support systems had failed, and Cadden had no choice but to wrap himself in a thin emergency blanket, though it offered little protection from the freezing dark outside. He had no way of knowing how much longer the oxygen would last. Maybe hours, maybe less. But what mattered more was the feeling creeping into his chest, the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Outside the window, the stars were distant and indifferent, like a cold reminder of how far humanity had fallen. The galaxy was vast, but it felt so empty. The enemies that had destroyed his ship were relentless, and no matter how hard they fought, it felt like there was no escape. The odds had stacked against them from the very beginning. Cadden leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly, trying to calm his racing mind. But then a sudden movement caught his eye, a shadow passing by the window. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a ship? No, it couldn't be. His communication systems were down and there was no way to make contact, but the shadow wasn't a hallucination, it was real. As his heart pounded faster, the sound of someone moving through the ship broke the silence. The door to the control room slid open with a hiss, and in stepped a figure clad in strange armor. She was tall with striking features, and her presence filled the room as if the very air had shifted. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, locked onto Cadden's, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The woman was an alien, but Cadden wasn't frightened. He could feel something about her. She was strong. More than that, she had an aura of power that seemed to command respect. She didn't need to speak, but when she did, her voice was calm and sure. "You're in danger," she said, her voice carrying a hint of authority that made Cadden stand a little straighter despite the circumstances. Cadden swallowed hard, trying to focus. "I know, the ship's going down and we're alone. I don't know if you're real or if I'm just losing my mind, but I don't have much time." The woman stepped closer, her boots making soft sounds on the metal floor. She reached out, her hand hovering near Cadden's shoulder, and he flinched, instinctively pulling away. But instead of harm, she placed her hand on his arm with surprising gentleness. "You're not alone," she said, her voice softer now, "and you're not losing your mind. I've been watching." Cadden stared at her, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Watching? Who are you?" "I am Arla," she replied, her gaze never leaving his. "A survivor, like you." Arla didn't look like someone who had survived a battle. Her armor was intricately designed as though it had been made for war, yet it was sleek and surprisingly elegant. But the most striking thing about her was the calmness she radiated, even in the face of such uncertainty. "Survivor?" Cadden repeated, still not fully grasping the situation. From what? From the way she held herself, Cadden realized that she was no ordinary traveler. She had been to places, seen things he could never begin to understand. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she carried herself. She was a warrior. "I was part of an expedition," Arla explained. "A mission to explore and reclaim the galaxy from those who would destroy it, but not all of us made it out alive." Her gaze turned distant for a moment, as if she were remembering something, or someone, important. "You and I are now the last hope for humanity and my people." Cadden blinked, trying to process the weight of her words. "Wait, you mean, you're not just here for me?" "No," she said firmly. "I'm here because the galaxy is on the brink of annihilation. The same forces that destroyed my people have set their sights on your world. I was sent to find survivors, to ensure that the hope for your people's survival doesn't vanish in the cold void of space." Cadden stared at her, disbelief mingling with something else. Hope. The idea that this alien warrior, a stranger in the vast emptiness, could be the key to saving humanity was hard to accept, but at the same time it felt like the only option left. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do we survive this?" Arla's expression hardened and she stepped back slightly. We fight. We find what's left of your fleet, gather resources, and do what we can to stop the impending war. We'll need to work together, Cadden. There is no choice. The cold around them seemed to deepen, but Cadden could feel the warmth of her presence, the heat of her determination. For the first time in what felt like ages, he didn't feel completely alone, and that was a feeling he wasn't willing to let go of. The two of them had no choice but to push forward, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Cadden nodded, a faint glimmer of resolve returning to his chest. All right, let's fight. The days that followed felt like a blur of activity. Cadden had barely processed the shock of meeting Arla before they were already moving, both of them scrambling to keep the ship operational. Arla had taken charge almost immediately, her calm demeanor providing a steady rhythm in the chaos. She worked without pause, checking the damaged systems and using tools that Cadden had never seen before, tools that seemed more like a weapon than a repair device. Yet with every swipe, every click, she made progress. Cadden, still adjusting to the presence of the alien warrior, did his best to help. He wasn't much of a mechanic, but he knew enough about the basics of ship repair to offer support. Still, there were moments when he found himself watching her, wondering how someone like her had ended up in a situation like this. She wasn't just an alien. She was someone who had seen battles, someone who had survived where others had failed. Despite the growing bond between them, Cadden couldn't shake the feeling that Arla was hiding something. Her story seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. But he pushed the thought away. He didn't have the luxury of questioning things now. His focus had to be on survival. The first few days, they spent in a constant race against time. Every time they fixed one system, another failed. Arla would go quiet for hours, her sharp eyes scanning the ship for any weaknesses, while Cadden worked alongside her trying to keep up. They had to conserve energy, stretch their supplies, and fix what they could with limited resources. It wasn't easy, and the tension between them grew as the days stretched into an uncomfortable silence. One night, after another exhausting day of repairs, they sat in the control room, both of them staring out at the cold expanse of space. The stars were far away, their beauty distant and unreachable. Cadden had long ago stopped asking how far they were from anything recognizable. There was no telling where they were anymore. The coordinates were lost, and so was their connection to the world they once knew. "We'll make it," Arla said softly, her eyes still fixed on the stars. Cadden glanced at her, wondering if she truly believed those words. Her calmness seemed so out of place in this endless dark, but he didn't question it. Maybe it was because she was used to this. Maybe this was normal for someone who had spent most of her life fighting for survival. "Do you really think so?" Cadden asked. He didn't mean it to sound doubtful, but the question lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of their situation. Arla didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her resolve was as solid as the ship's frame. "We have no choice but to make it. I didn't come this far to fail." "And neither should you?" Cadden didn't know how to respond. Part of him still couldn't fully accept her. She was an alien, a foreign force in his world. Yet in moments like this, when their eyes met, he could see the truth in her words. She wasn't just a stranger from another world. She was a warrior, and she had something that Cadden desperately needed right now: hope. That night, Cadden found sleep hard to come by. The hum of the ship seemed louder than usual, as if it was trying to remind him that time was running out. The oxygen levels were low, and every second counted. There was no room for doubt. He had to push forward, just like Arla was doing. But the quiet was broken by a sudden alarm blaring in the control room. Cadden's heart jumped, and he shot up from his seat, panic surging through him. "What is it?" he asked, looking at Arla. Arla's eyes flicked to the blinking console. She immediately began working, her fingers flying across the controls as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Cadden stood there, unsure of what was happening, but the seriousness in her eyes was enough to make him stay still. "We've been detected," Arla said, her voice sharp. "They've found us." Cadden's stomach dropped. He knew exactly who she meant. The enemy fleet, the ones who had destroyed her people, and now they were hunting them down. The hostile force that had already wiped out an entire species. And now they were coming for him. He didn't have time to process it. Arla's movements were quick and deliberate as she worked, pulling up a star map, rerouting power, and preparing the ship for a defensive maneuver. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady. "Prepare yourself, we're going to have to fight back." Cadden nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had no idea what they were about to face, but he couldn't let fear take over. Not now. Not when Arla was depending on him. Within moments, the ship shook violently, and Cadden was thrown into a console. He grunted in pain as he pushed himself up, trying to regain his balance. "They're firing on us!" Arla shouted over the alarm, her eyes wide with determination. "Hold on!" The ship rocked again, and Cadden was thrown to the side. He gripped the nearest seat and held on as the ship jerked and bucked under the assault. The hull groaned, and Cadden could hear the whine of metal under pressure. Every second felt like an eternity as Arla worked to keep them from being blown apart. Cadden's mind raced. He had no weapons, no training, no real way to defend himself. He had no choice but to rely on Arla, the mysterious alien who had pulled him from the brink of death. She was his only chance. Through the chaos, Cadden could hear Arla's voice, calm and controlled as she guided him through the madness. "Cadden, focus. The ship's shields are failing. We need to power up the aft thrusters. Help me reroute the energy." Cadden didn't hesitate. He rushed to her side, working alongside her, doing everything he could to help. The cold, the fear, it all faded into the background as they worked in sync. Their hands moved with purpose, fixing what they could, keeping the ship moving in the right direction. They had to survive this. For what felt like hours, they worked under the constant barrage of the enemy, but eventually the ship stabilized. The attacks lessened and the ship's systems came back online. The warning alarms stopped blaring and the shaking finally ceased. Cadden stood there, breathing heavily, his muscles sore from the strain. He glanced at Arla, who was staring at the console, her face unreadable. "We made it," Cadden said, almost in disbelief. Arla's lips twitched into a small smile, though her eyes still held the same steely focus. "We did, but this isn't over, not by a long shot." Cadden nodded. He knew she was right. The fight for survival was just beginning. The days after the battle were a blur, and yet each moment felt heavier than the last. Cadden's muscles were sore from the strain of trying to keep the ship afloat, and his mind seemed to never fully escape the chaos of the past few days. Yet there was no time to rest. The alien fleet was still out there, hunting them. They had to keep moving. Arla, however, seemed to take everything in stride. It was as if the constant threat of death didn't faze her at all. While Cadden struggled to focus on one task at a time, she moved with purpose, always working, always planning their next steps. She knew the galaxy's dangers too well. She had been through countless wars, and every mission felt like a matter of life and death. But what really struck Cadden was how little she spoke about her past. He had tried to ask her more about her people, about the war she had fought in, but she always deflected. Her answers were brief, her gaze distant, as if reliving those memories was something she didn't want to do. Yet it was clear that she was driven by a singular purpose: survival. Cadden, on the other hand, could not stop thinking about the future. The encounter with the alien fleet had shaken him. They had come so close to death. The ship had barely held together, and the crew, what was left of it, was now just a memory. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and sometimes he found himself questioning if they would even make it out alive. But Arla wouldn't let him dwell on those thoughts for long. She kept pushing him, urging him to focus, to work alongside her as they navigated through dangerous space lanes. They had no choice but to continue moving forward, no matter the risks. The ship's fuel was running low, and they had to make a stop at an abandoned outpost to resupply. It wasn't an ideal place, old, decaying, and covered in debris, but it was the only option available to them. The outpost was located on a barren planet, its surface covered in rocks and dust. There was no sign of life, just silence and the faint hum of a long-dead station. As they descended toward the planet, the ship shook once again, this time from the atmosphere. Cadden braced himself as the engines sputtered and the ship descended in a sharp arc toward the surface. He looked over at Arla, who remained calm, her hands steady on the controls. "You okay?" he asked, his voice strained. Arla glanced at him, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "I'm fine, but we need to move quickly. The enemy could be tracking us." Cadden nodded, though doubt lingered in his mind. He didn't know how much longer the ship could take such punishment. It felt as though every minute brought them closer to the edge, but there was no other choice. They had to resupply. The ship landed with a heavy thud, the landing gears crunching against the planet's rough surface. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the hatch opened, and the cold air of the barren world rushed in. Cadden stepped out first, his boots crunching against the dry, rocky ground. The planet was lifeless, with no signs of anything that had once lived here. The station in the distance loomed like a ghost of a past civilization, abandoned and forgotten. He could feel the weight of its emptiness in the air. Arla followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the area as she moved. She was always alert, always prepared for the worst. Cadden didn't know if it was her instincts or her training, but he had learned to trust her judgment. They made their way to the old outpost, which had clearly seen better days. Rusted doors and broken windows lined the walls, and the once vibrant walls were now peeling and decayed. Yet, despite the station's dilapidated state, it still held a sense of purpose. There were supplies here, and that was all that mattered now. Arla led the way, moving with practiced ease as she navigated through the dark corridors of the outpost. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was quiet, too quiet, and Cadden couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick with tension, like they were being watched. "Stay close," Arla whispered, her voice low and urgent. "This place may not be as abandoned as it seems." Cadden's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean by that? He hadn't heard any signs of life, but he trusted her instincts. He followed her deeper into the station, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. They reached a storage room near the back of the station, and Arla immediately began working, rummaging through the crates and containers. Cadden stepped closer, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. There was something off about this place. Then, just as he was about to speak, he heard it, a faint sound coming from the dark hallway outside the room. It was the soft shuffle of footsteps. Cadden's body tensed. He reached for the blaster at his side, but before he could react, Arla's hand shot out to stop him. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Cadden felt his breath catch in his throat. Whoever or whatever was coming, they were almost here. Arla motioned for Cadden to stay low, and they both crouched behind a stack of crates, hiding in the shadows. Cadden's mind raced. Was it the enemy? Had they found them already? The footsteps stopped just outside the room, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, the door to the storage room creaked open. Cadden's heart hammered in his chest as he held his breath. Arla remained perfectly still beside him, her eyes locked on the door. She was waiting, patient, calculating. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he trusted her. The door opened fully, and standing in the doorway was a figure, an alien, but not one Cadden had seen before. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were different from the species he had encountered. Its skin was a deep shade of green, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. It didn't speak, but it didn't need to. The tension in the room was enough to communicate its intent. Cadden's hand tightened on the blaster, but Arla stopped him once again. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and calm, her face unreadable. "Who are you?" Arla asked, her voice commanding yet measured. The alien tilted its head, studying her for a moment before answering. "We are the last. You are not supposed to be here." Cadden's mind raced as the words sank in. The last? Who were they? And why were they here? Arla stepped forward, her gaze unyielding. "We are here to survive. We need the supplies, and we need your help. Can you help us?" The alien's gaze flickered to Cadden and back to Arla. It seemed to weigh her words, considering something far beyond the reach of human understanding. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the alien lowered its weapon. "We will see if you are worthy," it said. The alien's words hung in the air, thick with meaning, as Cadden stood frozen in place. He didn't know what to make of the creature before him, its glowing eyes scanning them both with a sense of ancient wisdom. It had spoken in a language Cadden couldn't understand, but somehow its tone and gestures made it clear. This encounter would determine everything. Arla didn't hesitate. She took a step forward, her posture unwavering as she met the alien's gaze head-on. The tension in the room seemed to grow tighter, and Cadden felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He had no idea what was happening or how to help, but he wasn't about to back down. He trusted Arla. If she thought this was their way out, then he would follow her lead. The alien's gaze never left Arla. "You seek to survive," it said, its voice low, almost like a whisper, yet it felt as though the words were pressing in from all sides. "But survival is not enough. You must prove that you are worthy of the path you choose." Arla nodded slowly. "We are ready," she replied, her voice strong and steady. "We will prove our worth." The alien stepped back, its form melding into the shadows, and Cadden had the distinct feeling that they were being watched by forces far beyond their comprehension. He couldn't shake the feeling that this place, the outpost, the planet, everything, held secrets that had been buried for millennia, secrets that Arla knew how to unlock. "We must move quickly," Arla said, breaking the silence. "We don't have much time. The enemy is still out there, and they will not wait for us." Cadden followed her lead, though his mind was racing. Who were these aliens? What did they want? And what did the path mean? He didn't have the answers, but for now, he knew only one thing. He couldn't let Arla face this alone. If they were going to survive, they had to stick together. The alien led them deeper into the station, moving silently through the corridors as if it was familiar with every twist and turn. Cadden's footsteps echoed loudly in the emptiness, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were being led into a trap. But Arla walked ahead, confident, as if she had already seen the end of this journey. She seemed unshaken, and that steadied Cadden's nerves, even though doubt still crept into his thoughts. They reached a chamber at the center of the outpost, a large, circular room with walls covered in intricate carvings and strange symbols. The air inside the chamber felt different, thick, charged with energy. Cadden glanced around, his eyes drawn to the glowing lines that seemed to pulse with life. The room was ancient, but somehow still alive, as if it held the memory of something far greater than any of them could understand. The alien stopped in the center of the room, its eyes glowing brighter as it turned to face them. "This is the trial of worth," it said, its voice now filled with a strange resonance. "Only those who can prove their strength and resolve will earn the right to wield the power that lies hidden here." Arla stood tall, her expression unwavering. "We are ready for the trial," she said again, her voice calm but firm. The alien nodded and extended one of its long, slender arms, pointing toward the center of the room. There, embedded in the floor, was a large, glowing stone. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its light shifting between colors that Cadden couldn't quite identify. The stone seemed to call out to him, and for a moment he felt a strange connection to it, as though it recognized him, as though it knew something about him that even he didn't. "This stone," the alien explained, "holds the power to restore balance. It is ancient, a relic of a time long past, but only those worthy can unlock its potential." Cadden's mind spun. What was this stone? What did it mean? He looked at Arla, but her face revealed nothing. She was focused, her eyes fixed on the stone with a quiet intensity. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't hesitant, she was determined. Without another word, the alien moved aside, allowing Arla and Cadden to approach the stone. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as they stepped closer, the weight of the moment settling on their shoulders. The air grew heavy, charged with anticipation. Arla knelt beside the stone, her fingers hovering just above its surface. Cadden watched her closely, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew this was their chance. The trial was their only way forward. They had no choice but to succeed. Arla's hand touched the stone, and in that moment the entire room seemed to come alive. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, the air vibrating with power. Cadden's breath caught in his throat as the stone began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that filled the chamber. It was as if the stone itself was awakening, responding to Arla's touch. Suddenly, a burst of light exploded from the stone, blinding Cadden for a moment. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in a different place. The room was gone, replaced by a vast, empty landscape stretching out before him. He looked around in confusion, his heart racing. "Where are we?" Cadden asked, his voice trembling. Arla was beside him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is the trial," she said quietly, "the test of our worth." The landscape around them was barren, filled with strange, twisted trees and jagged rocks. The sky above was dark, filled with swirling clouds and flashes of lightning. It was a place of turmoil, of struggle, but also of potential. Ahead of them, Cadden saw a figure, a dark shape moving slowly toward them. It was tall, towering, and as it approached, Cadden could feel a coldness emanating from it, a deep, unnatural chill. He didn't know what it was, but he could sense its power. "This is the challenge," Arla said, her voice steady. "We must face it together." Cadden nodded, gripping his blaster tightly, though he knew it would be useless in this strange place. The figure grew closer, and Cadden could see its features more clearly. It was humanoid, but its skin was dark and smooth, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It seemed to be made of the very darkness around them. "Stay close," Arla warned. The figure stopped in front of them and Cadden's heart raced. It was not an enemy, not in the way he had expected. Instead, it was a trial, a force meant to test their resolve, their strength, and their will to survive. It spoke then, its voice echoing in Cadden's mind. "Prove your worth or perish." Cadden looked at Arla, and for the first time he saw something other than determination in her eyes. There was something else, something deeper, uncertainty. But she didn't let it show. She stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they took a step forward. The trial had begun, and there was no turning back. The trial had begun. Cadden and Arla stood facing the shadowy figure, which loomed before them like a dark mirror of the world they had left behind. Its presence was heavy, oppressive, and as the seconds stretched into minutes, Cadden could feel the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. The air was thick, and every step they took forward seemed to draw them deeper into a space that was both unfamiliar and alien. The figure was silent, its glowing eyes fixed on them, its shape indistinct, as if the shadows themselves were its form. Cadden tried to steady his breathing, but his heart raced in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. This was unlike anything he had faced before. This was not a battle he could fight with weapons or fists. This was a trial of something far more important. Arla stepped forward, her expression unwavering. She didn't look back at Cadden, but instead stared at the figure in front of them. Cadden hesitated for a moment, then followed her lead, staying close to her side. He knew she had faced countless trials like this, but he had never felt more out of place. He had no experience with these alien tests, no knowledge of what would happen next. He was just a man from a distant planet, thrust into a world he didn't understand. The figure remained motionless, and as they approached, Cadden felt a strange pull, an invisible force that seemed to draw him in, urging him to step forward. It wasn't fear that made him move, but something else. Curiosity, a desire to prove that humanity could survive, to show that they weren't just survivors, but warriors, capable of standing up to the unknown. "You must face yourself," the figure said, its voice low and resonant. It didn't speak with its mouth, but rather directly into their minds. "To pass the trial, you must confront your deepest fear." Cadden's stomach twisted at the words. Fear. It was something he had been running from his entire life, something he had buried deep inside. The fear of failure, the fear of losing everything, the fear of not being enough. He had carried those fears with him every day since the destruction of his home, since the moment his world was shattered by the chaos of war. Arla stood tall and unmoving, her face a mask of determination. But Cadden could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, something that told him she, too, had fears she had never spoken of. Her past, her people, the wars she had fought. He knew she carried the weight of all that with her, just as he carried his own burdens. But unlike him, she didn't let those fears control her. She faced them head-on. The figure's voice broke through Cadden's thoughts. "You must prove that you are not bound by fear. Only then will you be worthy." Cadden looked at Arla, her eyes now meeting his. She nodded, as if silently encouraging him to take the next step. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. He stepped forward, and as he did, the world around him began to shift. The landscape, once barren and twisted, suddenly transformed. The shadows dissolved, replaced by images from his past. He saw himself as a child, standing in his home, surrounded by the warmth and safety of his family. He saw the faces of his parents, smiling, proud of him. But then the images twisted. The smile on his father's face vanished, replaced by a look of fear, a scream. The warmth turned to coldness. The peaceful home was torn apart by explosions. Cadden recoiled, his chest tightening as the memories flooded back. He had never fully allowed himself to remember the horrors of that day, the day everything had been destroyed. The day he had lost everyone, the day he had realized that survival was all that mattered. "You're weak," the voice of the figure echoed in his mind. "You carry your pain, your fear. You will never be worthy as long as you let it define you." Cadden stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The memories were overwhelming, suffocating. He wanted to escape, to run from the pain. But the figure's words kept coming, each one a cold reminder of what he had lost. "You cannot run from the truth," the figure continued. "You are afraid. You will always be afraid. That is your burden." Cadden felt the weight of the words pressing down on him, and for a moment he was paralyzed. He had been afraid his whole life, afraid of losing more. Afraid of being powerless, afraid of failure. He had buried that fear, hidden it deep inside, but now it was coming to the surface. He was afraid and he couldn't escape it. But then something shifted inside him, a flicker of resolve. He had faced death countless times. He had fought through battles that should have killed him. He had survived against all odds. This fear, this pain, he couldn't let it control him anymore. It was time to face it, to let go of the past and step forward. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Arla's words echoed in his mind. We fight. We survive. We face the darkness together. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Arla by his side, and he had his own strength. He opened his eyes, meeting the figure's gaze once more. This time there was no fear in him, only determination. "I am not afraid," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I will not let my past control me. I am more than what happened to me." The figure's form flickered, its shadowy shape twisting as if the words had struck a chord. The air around them crackled with energy, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with power. The figure stepped back, its gaze softening, though its voice remained strong. "You have faced your fear," it said. "You have shown your strength. You are worthy." The world around them began to shift again, the landscape fading away as a bright light filled the space. Cadden shielded his eyes, feeling a rush of warmth fill his chest. For a moment he felt like he was floating, weightless. Then the light faded and he found himself back in the chamber, standing beside Arla. The alien, the shadowy figure, was gone. The trial was over. Cadden looked at Arla, and for the first time he saw a hint of a smile on her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know that she too had passed her own trial. They had both faced their fears, and they had both emerged victorious. The chamber was quiet now, the tension lifted. The energy that had once filled the room faded, leaving only a sense of calm. Cadden felt something inside him shift. He had faced the darkness, he had fought his own demons, and he had won. "We're ready," Arla said, her voice calm and sure. "We can face whatever comes next." Cadden nodded, his heart still racing, but no longer from fear. They had proved themselves. They were ready for the next battle. Whatever it was, they would face it together. As they walked out of the chamber, the stars above seemed brighter. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, but for the first time, Cadden didn't feel like he was fighting alone. Together, they could overcome anything.